you tell me a bit about this program funded by the Menzies Foundation under the Ninian Stevens Law Program?
Yes, that's a new program. It's called New Legal Thinking for Emerging Technologies. And it's really about preparing lawyers for the new emerging technologies that are coming and how they can provide better legal and ethical advice to those technologies.
Oh, great. So what are you currently working on the project?
We're currently in the data collection phase. We are interviewing lawyers who provide advice about technology. This will help us to understand where the knowledge gaps are so that we can do further research to address these gaps. So if you're a lawyer in Australia who provides advice about technology, please reach out to us.
Okay, so the title of the project is New Legal Thinking for Emerging Technologies. So what is the new legal thinking?
New legal thinking describes the kind of the skills that lawyers need to go beyond the analysis of law based on existing precedent and legislation. To do this with new and emerging technologies, lawyers need to be able to conceptualize the use and management of new and emerging technology as a complex system of how people, technology and regulation interact.
And so how did this project come about and how come a computer scientist is leading it?
That's a good question. So it came about via a discussion between myself and Professor Jeannie Patterson, who's the other co-director of CADE. And Jeannie was talking about conversations she'd had with lawyers who were providing this type of advice and students who she was teaching, and said that they often felt they had a skills gap in the ability to analyse and provide legal advice on new technologies. So because a sort of typical way that a lawyer provides advice is to look at case law and precedents, that model doesn't work so well when there's emerging technology where there is no precedents and perhaps regulation hasn't caught up yet. And when she talked about the types of problems that they were having, the types of ways to think about it sounded a lot like the way that computer scientists and engineers more generally think about how people and technology interact with their environment. And so our hunch is those types of techniques put into more of a legal context will be a good way for lawyers to think about these problems. So it's really a really good example of two disciplines colliding, that because we talk a couple of times a week about these types of problems, the whole idea of the project came about.
Oh, it's very exciting.
We have read a lot about Ninian and Stephen from a professional point of view, but you were fortunate enough to be friends with him. Can you tell us a bit about Ninian as a person and friend?
I worked with him very closely in several capacities, one in particular, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And yes, I think over that time we did become friends, but in many ways we were sort of professional colleagues as well. So the capacity in which I worked most closely with him was on a body called the Constitutional Centenary Foundation, that you've probably never heard of. But it was set up at the beginning of the 1990s as Australia was approaching the centenary of its constitution. And we took a bet that over that decade there would be a lot of interest in the constitution, and we were right. And we set up an organisation to try to involve Australian people broadly in constitutional discussions. And I won't bore you with the details, but it necessarily involved people from all sides of politics, the Commonwealth, states and local government, and that became, and inevitably was, quite a sensitive exercise. Who did they get to chair this foundation? Ninian Stephen. He was the perfect person. Commanded tremendous respect from all sides of politics, all levels of government, all walks of life. And I was the deputy chair. And so we worked together very collaboratively over a period of 5 years until, from my point of view, he was unfortunately appointed to the International Court of Justice and had to disappear. And I missed him greatly because he'd been such an important force for good during that time.
And so what would you say are some of the characteristics that Ninian Stephen had that made him such a respected person to group people like that?
Well, he was a very impressive figure in the nicest possible way, not remote, but he had a presence, he had a beautiful way of speaking, he had a lovely manner, and he had a great way of avoiding trouble if it was coming. And
good skill.
And of course and of course he was also extremely intelligent and had a lot of sort of experience in different walks of life himself. And so he was a very good person to do something that on the one hand required quite significant constitutional knowledge, which ideally couldn't be questioned too deeply, but on the other hand required him to actually relate to people. And he did a great job in both those respects. He was a very interesting and unusual man from that point of view.
Do you have a favourite story about Ninian?
I don't really have a favourite story, or not one that I can remember any longer. I'm sure at the time I had a lot of favourite stories that I used to recount. But so one generally, just to build on what I've already said really, if you're sitting around a table with politicians who are in government from different sides of politics and all levels of government, plus another sort of couple of people who were deemed to be important to an exercise like that, there could be some really difficult moments. People raising difficult issues that needed to be resolved by the group, or people just sometimes being a bit obstructive because that was where they were coming from, not in any pejorative way. And Ninian just had the greatest way of dealing with that. Depending on what the issue was, he would either ignore it or misunderstand it or answer it at a general level, never in a way that left people feeling dissatisfied, but never in a way that caused conflict either. And it was a technique that I've never managed to master, but I always admired greatly.
Truly diplomatic.
Yes, in the nicest possible way, yes.
What do you think he would think about our project?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. I don't know how technologically advanced Ninian himself was, and they were earlier days before computers were quite so de rigueur as they are now. But on the other hand, he was a very forward-looking person. And I think that's why he did so much in his professional life. It's very unusual to not only be a Justice of the High Court, but a Judge of the International Court of Justice and Governor-General and Chair of the Constitutional Centenary Foundation and all the other things that he undoubtedly did. And even in his High Court judgments, he was an original thinker. There was a very early decision in Australian constitutional terms that raised the question of fairness in electoral systems, fairness in voting systems. And I still sometimes think back to Ninian's judgment in that case. He took a very broad and thoughtful approach to it that talked about the very concept of representation. What does it mean to be represented in a system of government? And that judgment of his is still highly relevant today. And in fact, I thought about it during the last election and thought, we're still thinking about what do we mean by representation in this country? And he really laid the foundation for it. So I think he was a forward-looking person, and I think he'd be very pleased indeed to have his name associated with this enterprise.
Well, thanks heaps for the time and for giving us more of an insight into Ninian Stephen.
Good. Well, nice to have met you both.
Yeah, you too. Thanks so much for your time.
Next time. Pleasure.